John Lothian News wants you to be safe and for us to be able to return to being with one another again. To get there, we need to do the following to beat this pandemic. Wear a mask, stay 6 feet apart, wash your hands for 20 seconds at a time, and self-monitor your temperature. Stay safe, stay smart.
Help capture the history of our markets by contributing to the John Lothian News GoFundMe campaign to support the Markets Wiki Education history-focused video series and more.
This entry in the Path to Electronic Trading series is sponsored by CQG.
I attended law school at Syracuse University, and in the past it wouldn't have been a big deal except that my classmate was Joe Biden, and we've been friends for 55 years, so it's kind of sweet after having this relationship with this man for all these years to see where he's ending up. After law school, I went right to Wall Street, and I worked at a securities brokerage firm that did institutional business and also did international business. And my dad was affiliated with the firm, and I worked there in the legal and compliance area for almost 6 years. And during my last year at the firm, there were some guys from Chicago who came to visit us, and they had this wacky idea that they were going to trade options on stocks in Chicago. But what made it interesting is the people in the firm, number one, understood options from their historic experience, what used to be called the put and call business. And second, they traded a lot of stocks and thought that if this thing might work, then it would help them hedge their stock positions. So it was intriguing enough and inexpensive enough because the seat was only $10,000. So they looked at me and they said, you have to have an officer of the firm be selected to be the what was called registered options principal. And they pointed to me because I was the lowly assistant vice president, but high enough to take the test. So I took the test, and it was a take-home test, but it forced me to learn options, which I never knew before. And the whole idea was to qualify the firm so they could do business with customers, but the firm never really planned to do a customer business. They wanted to really trade for their own account against stock positions they acquired in their block trading activities. I took the test, found it interesting, and went home to my wife and told her I was doing this, and she said, you know, you're having a terrible year financially because the firm already by March of 1973, we knew we were not even going to get a bonus. And we all lived for our bonuses because business was so bad. And so she said, why don't you do something that makes the year worthwhile? And I said, well, what do you mean? She goes, well, if you're not going to make any money, do something that might help further your career. I said, what do you mean? She said, like, write an article about something. Do something that you can look back on the year that you've accomplished something. And so I took it seriously. She's usually right. She was right on this one. And I decided to write an article about the CBOE in a legal journal for other law and compliance officers on what this new exchange was and how to follow the rules. April 26, 1973 comes, and I get a phone call from the trading desk, and they go, we have an order from a customer on an option. What do we do? Because we never solicited orders. We didn't think about it very much, but customers were following the development of the CBOE and decided that they wanted to do something, and I'll never forget that day because we never expected it. We were an institutional firm, and therefore it wasn't something we had put on our radar screen. So I had to scramble, but I had written the article, so I knew what to do. And it was all about suitability and levels of approval for accounts and other things. The contacts from CBOE early on were Joe Sullivan, who was the founding president, and a guy named Gary Knight, who was a fellow who worked with Joe in marketing and selling seats. And they literally went around to the different brokerage firms and said, we have something new, would you buy a seat? And there were many New York firms who said yes, firms like Merrill Lynch and Goldman Sachs. There were other firms who looked down their nose at options, like we don't do that, like Morgan Stanley. So it was interesting that certain firms signed on early, and then the old Put and Call Dealers Association, which was these over-the-counter dealers, first of all dismissed it as being just, who are these people from Chicago? They can think they can trade anything on a security. On the other hand, there were other people who said, for $10,000 bucks, let's give it a chance. So you had a real interesting kind of dichotomy there. And then a big thing was occurring in 1973, and that is that in the securities industry, what was called later the Big Bang in Europe was called May Day in the U.S., in New York, because it was May 1st, 1974, when the SEC, after years of fighting the industry, forced the industry to start unfixing commissions. So May 1st of 74, commissions on floor trading was abolished. May 1st of 75, commissions for customers was being abolished. And this was a very hard-fought battle and very disruptive to the industry. The firm I was with, called Modell Rowland and Company, was an institutional firm, and they did a lot of what was called block trading, and they needed a lot of capital. And they were worried that with the unfixing commissions, they didn't have enough capital to compete with what then the big players was Salomon Brothers and Goldman Sachs. So they decided in the fall of 73 that they were going to sell the firm or merge with another firm. And so here I am, 29 years old, my dad's managing partner, and they were the partners, the main partners were all in their mid-60s, so they looked and said, if we don't get out now, our capital might go down the drain. We've got to do something. And they started thinking about doing deals with other firms. I looked at it and I said to my dad, I said, look, you got to protect yourself. Don't worry about me. He was worried what happened if they merged and what would happen to me. I said, don't worry about me. I'll find a job, because this is a very tumultuous time in the industry. Let me find a job that gives you the flexibility to do what you want. So even before they established who they were going to make a deal with, I started looking for a job, and I literally, in the winter of 73, looked in the classified ad pages of the New York Times and saw that they were advertising for an attorney at the American Stock Exchange. And in those days, the American Stock Exchange, for the staff, had a very good reputation, because they had been through their own traumas in the late 60s, and they had a very professional staff, more than the New York Stock Exchange, which was much more I'd say hidebound and very secure. The Amex had to try hard. It was like the Avis of the securities industry in those days. I literally applied for the job in December of 1973. In January, they told me they wanted to hire me, and it took about a couple of weeks to negotiate a deal. They were hiring me as an attorney in their policy planning and government relations division, which was dealing with the SEC and the Congress, something I found very interesting and certainly different than the compliance and legal work that I was doing. But then, because I worked for my dad, I wanted to give him plenty of time to replace me, so I agreed that I would start in late February at the American Stock Exchange. And that's how I moved from the securities brokerage firm to the American Stock Exchange. And I worked at the American Stock Exchange from February of 74 until 1982 in various roles. I'm not going to cover them in great detail, other than to tell you that in my position in the policy planning area, they decided, watching CBOE from 73 to 74, right as I was arriving, that this was something that they needed to look at very seriously. Not because they liked options, but because the main product the American Stock Exchange traded were these secondary stocks, not the big ones at the New York Stock Exchange, but the smaller ones. But they also had the very speculative stocks, like Canadian oil mining stocks and gambling stocks. And what happened is they were worried that a speculator, instead of trading an unknown $3 Canadian mining stock, could trade a $3 call option on IBM or GE. And they were worried that the speculative dollars that flowed to the Amex would move to the CBOE. So the Amex made a strategic decision to start trading options. So they were the second exchange in the world to copy the CBOE invention. And they had very good relationships with the SEC, and the SEC encouraged competition. And so the Amex worked very hard. And that drew me into the planning for the option business. And I literally helped them get in the business. And again, I had written this article, so I knew all about the rules, gave me credibility both at the Amex and at the SEC. And on January 13th, 1975, the Amex started trading options. But in those days, the CBOE had all the good stock options, all the good underlying stocks, because they were the leader. Amex had to then pick whatever else was left, because there was no multiple listing at that point. And then within a few years thereafter, the Philadelphia Exchange came in to trade options on stocks. The Pacific Exchange came in to trade options on stocks. Later, the Midwest Exchange, which became the Chicago Exchange, started trading options on stocks. And even later, the New York Stock Exchange started trading options on stocks. As my role at the Amex increased, so did my visibility. And in March of '82, I got a phone call from a major U.S. search firm, Spencer Stewart. Would I have lunch with one of their partners? They want to talk to me about a job prospect or position. And I remember meeting with them in the what was called the Big Kitchen of the World Trade Center at the time. It was only a block from the Amex, but it was a very hush-hush kind of meeting. And they said to me, look, we're interested in a very senior position at a Chicago exchange. And I said, well, if it's the Board of Trade or the CBOE, I'm not interested. And they said, why? I said, because they have a very bad reputation of how they treat their staff. This is back in the 70s and 80s. And they go, sit down. I was about to leave. And they said, sit down. It's not the CBOE and it's not the Board of Trade. I said, well, who is it? He said, the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. I said, I don't know much about the Chicago Mercantile Exchange because I had never had any contact, because the Board of Trade I knew because of the OCC board members, but the CBOE, of course, I knew. But the Board of Trade and the CBOE had a culture of very strong member control from the trading floor. So if you were a staff member, it was not necessarily a good experience. But it was the CME, the Merc. I knew nothing about the Merc. The Merc had gotten into financial futures right about the same time that CBOE got into options. They started trading what was called the International Monetary Market in 1982, starting with futures on foreign currencies. And then shortly thereafter, they got into interest rate futures through U.S. Treasury bills. And so I really knew nothing about the CME, and I said, "Oh, I'm willing to have that conversation. I don't know these people. Let me explore it." And I remember meeting Jack Sandner, who was the chairman at the time, and Leo Melamed in a hotel room in Washington D.C. because they were there lobbying about tax legislation at the time, and they happened to be holed up in Washington D.C. And for me to sneak out of the Amex for a day and take a day off is how I did it. I literally took the shuttle from New York to Washington, met them for lunch, spent 2 or 3 hours, and got back on the shuttle and went home. And then the question is, what's going to happen next? And shortly thereafter, I heard that they were very interested in pursuing a conversation with me to be Chief Operating Officer of the exchange, which was the number 2 position. But I was not interested in making such a dramatic move from New York to Chicago for the number 2 spot. And they said to me, that's okay. That's the job that's available now. But the CEO, a guy named Clayton Yiter, was a real Washington guy. He had left the Reagan administration because Jimmy Carter had won and had taken the job, but he wants to get back to Washington. So basically, if you come and take this number 2 job and Clayton leaves, you'll have a very good inside shot, no guarantees, of the CEO and presidency. Well, that intrigued me. And it was true that Clayton really didn't want to stay at the exchange. He wanted to get back to D.C., and so I was willing to have further negotiations. What it made it easier for us to do is 2 things about coming to Chicago. One is that when I would come to Chicago to OCC board meetings, I remember saying to Joan, you got to come see Chicago. It's like a clean New York. And second, I was very impressed with the people I had met on the OCC board. There was a different culture of the trading community in Chicago than it was in New York. In New York, I remember saying to my dad, how do you become a specialist on the New York Stock Exchange? And he looked at me and says, your father's got to be a specialist. So it was an inherited thing, and it was very hard to break into. In Chicago, it was a much more open environment that if a young kid from the suburbs or even from the city wanted to be a trader at the Board of Trade, the CBO, or the CME, all he had to do was go in and knock on a door and say, I want to be a trader, would you back me? And if the people running the firms liked the guy, they didn't have to know anybody. They were willing to take a chance on new people. It was a much more open, kind of free market environment. And I liked that a lot. It was a very attractive part of what I had been exposed to at the OCC board. Having started at the CME in September of 1982, obviously I was drinking out of a fire hose. I was in charge of an institution that was growing so fast that one of the reasons they brought me in is my predecessor really was not able to control the growth of the staff. And historically, what's very important to understand is that the staffs at the Chicago exchanges were operated very differently than the staffs at the New York Stock Exchange and the American Stock Exchange. They were much more well-established institutions. They were not doing creative things like creating new products, and the staff structure was very different. And what I was trying to do is to try to take the best of both worlds. What did I learn at the Amex of how to treat a professional staff and yet how to be flexible and deal with a very raucous, very aggressive membership? And that was a real challenge because there were so many more people. And at the Amex when I was there were maybe 700 members, if I recall correctly. At the Merck when I was there were thousands. And very often the members who chaired the committees felt that the staff worked for them. So one of the things I had to establish early on was that the staff reports to me, not to the member chairman member committees. And that was not culturally an easy thing to establish. So I was chief operating officer from September of 82 until the June 1st of 84, when Clayton Yiter announced he was going to leave, and he became U.S. trade rep under Bush the First. And once Clayton was planning to leave, it was necessary for them to announce that I would be replacing him, and it literally was June of 84. He didn't leave until June of 85, so I actually was like in the wings for a year, but in a way it was good because it gave me the opportunity to establish myself. So I became president and CEO on June 1st of 85, and there were lots of things to do. The place was growing like topsy. In the Thanksgiving weekend of 84, we moved into the new building. That was a big challenge. We were setting up an exchange in Singapore. That was a challenge. And we were trading stock index futures, which was really the main reason that the CME wanted me in the first place, because for the first time they were entering the equity world. And in entering the equity world, they knew they didn't know anything about it. I mean, they could trade agricultural products. They could deal interest rate products. Equities were a whole different thing. So their ability to trade stock index futures and my knowledge of the SEC, of the securities exchanges, and how stocks traded was a very important part of my role there. So I was at the CME until the spring of the winter of 97. Duke Chapman, who had been the chairman and CEO of the CBOE, announced he was leaving. CBOE had a big search on. I had already been at CME for 15 years. And the CBOE was, in many respects, where I was back going home, because I knew the option business from the Amex, and it was also the securities business, not the futures business. So I decided it was time for a change. And I literally went from Wacker Drive to LaSalle Street. And it was it was like almost like a homecoming. Obviously, the Option Clearing Corp was there. All the exchanges that were trading options were there. But from a trading practice point of view, it was a very different business than the futures business. And I was at the CBOE as chairman and CEO from winter of 97 until 2013, when I announced I was stepping down as CEO. I became executive chairman. I announced I'd be joining my son's firm, which is an investment management firm that invests only in international stocks, called Cedar Street Asset Management. I continued to be chairman of the exchange for 4 more years. So in the spring of 2017, I left the CBOE, having been chairman for 20 years.
John Lothian News would like to thank those individuals who have contributed to our Markets Wiki Education GoFundMe campaign. Their financial assistance allows us to produce and distribute videos like this for our Open Outcry Traders History Project or the Path to Electronic Trading video series. Join them in supporting John Lothian News, capturing the history of our industry.